Welcome to the Gastro Girl podcast. We bring together patients, experts, and health advocates who are all here to help you optimize your health. Here's your host, Jacqueline Gollin.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Gastro Girl podcast. We are so grateful to be joined by the amazing registered dietitian, Patsy Catsos. She is actually a medical nutrition therapist, FODMAP expert, and author, and the focus of her practice is digestive health, including irritable bowel syndrome, gluten-related disorders, and inflammatory bowel disease. She's written several books. I know you have several iterations of IBS, Free at Last, and a leading FODMAP expert. She was one of the pioneers who really got the word out in the States. So we're so happy to be joined by you. Hi, Patsy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So we are actually going to embark on a series with Patsy, and we're going to take our listeners through some really important pieces of IBS and its relationship to FODMAPs and the low FODMAP diet. And today's episode, we're going to focus on FODMAPs 101. Sound like a plan, Patsy?
Yes, I'm really excited to talk about strategies for success on the FODMAP elimination diet.
Yeah, so this is an important episode because there's lots of stuff out there on the low FODMAP diet, from everyone from people claiming they're gut experts to people that are gut experts, such as yourself, who have a focus in gastrointestinal diseases and conditions and are trained in working with clients who need to implement dietary therapies such as the low FODMAP, which is more of an intervention than a diet as we know it, correct?
Right, that is right. It is not designed as a weight loss diet. It's designed to help people manage irritable bowel syndrome or IBS-like symptoms in a few other conditions.
So for those listeners who may not know, we're going to back it up and we're going to give a little bit of an overview on what IBS is. And so let's just explore what that is.
Sure. Well, IBS stands for irritable bowel syndrome. It's a very common disorder. They say somewhere between 10 and 20% of Americans are affected by IBS, which is a pretty huge number. And people with IBS tend to have abdominal pain over an extended period of time. It's not just a one-day thing. It's something that affects you over weeks and months, and altered bowel habits. So some people have diarrhea predominant IBS, and some people have constipation predominant IBS, and probably the most people have a mixed bowel pattern. And in the old days, you used to have a whole bunch of tests to, rule out other conditions before you'd be given kind of a diagnosis of exclusion of IBS. But today, it's something that your doctor might diagnose in the office based on your symptom pattern. And, they'd compare that to the diagnosis criteria for IBS and make sure that you don't have any so-called alarm symptoms. And if everything matches, then you could be diagnosed with IBS right there without even, any tests or procedures at all.
Now, there are numerous ways and also oftentimes multidisciplinary ways to treat IBS or to manage IBS. And one of the ways is through dietary intervention. And this is where you come in. So I might be a patient and the doctor tells me I have IBS and I say, well, I don't want to take medicine. Like, what can I do? And one of the first things that they might say to me as a patient, right, is, hey, you should really work with a registered dietitian, and I'd like you to try the low FODMAP diet. And I'm like, what? And I go home and I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, I have no idea what to do. So this is where you come in, and please tell us, start with, what are FODMAPs and why should we care about them?
Sure. Well, FODMAP is an acronym, and it stands for a bunch of jargon, but it's basically referring to a group of certain sugars and certain fibers in food that can cause GI distress in people with IBS. That's what they are in a nutshell.
Why are they in our food?
Well, they're naturally occurring in our food. Sugars are in our food to make them taste good to us. And the FODMAP fibers are in food because they are the storage forms of energy for plants. So, the fructans and the GOS type fibers that are under the FODMAP umbrella are used up actually in the sprouting process for things like beans and nuts. So that's why they're in those foods.
And all foods not all foods they have different levels of FODMAPs, right? We hear high and low.
Right.
So this is where it gets confusing for patients. So if I come to you, first of all, how do I know if this is the right intervention for me? And like, how would we begin? How would we even start this?
Right. That's a really, really good question because there are lots of different ways to use what we know about FODMAPs. A lot of times we hear about low FODMAP diets or FODMAP elimination diets. And not everybody has to go the route of a full-fledged low FODMAP diet or a FODMAP elimination diet, although that probably is what we're going to be talking about the most today. It's important to try to figure out before you start that if you're really a good candidate for one of those things. And first of all, you need to make sure that you've had a proper evaluation by your doctor and that you really do have IBS and not something that needs a different kind of management. Okay. And then you need to really ask yourself whether you might have any hint of disordered eating behavior or any history of eating disorder, because people with those problems really shouldn't try a really formal elimination diet because it can be triggering for them. It tends to be a safe diet for almost everybody else, but still, there are a few people that just don't care to do like a really involved dietary experiment, or maybe they don't have good access to being in charge of their own food life. Maybe they live on a campus or in an assisted living facility or something. It's harder for those people. But if you have control over your food choices and you're not in that at-risk category for disordered eating, then it could be a very appropriate choice for you to try a low FODMAP diet.
Yeah, I want to just go back to what you said, because I think this is really an important point about the restrictive eating and being too restrictive that it becomes disordered eating. Or if you have a history of disordered eating, this may not be the right plan for you, because we've heard that people get anxious they're afraid to eat. They're afraid to eat certain things because they don't want to have those symptoms. And this is like two things I want to bring up. One, this is why it's important to work with a dietitian, right? Because you want to make sure that when you take something out of your diet, that you're replacing it with something so you're not depleting certain nutrients, right?
Even if the doctor suggests, hey, you should try a low FODMAP diet, it would be really great to do that check-in with yourself. And I wish that doctors would let the dietitian help decide if it's really a good idea or not, because sometimes they just do not have time to help the patient find out whether it's, really appropriate for them or not. Patients don't always disclose their, concerns about any of their eating behaviors to their gastroenterologist. It just doesn't come up in that short office visit. So yeah, we definitely are trained to help patients decide about that.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What happens, like why each FODMAP is not created equally, and why lentils may bother me as a high FODMAP food, but they may not bother someone else with IBS?
Okay, so why would FODMAPs cause symptoms? They have two things in common. First of all, they are the very favorite foods, very rapidly fermented by the normal gut bacteria. That sounds scary at first, but really fermentation is a perfectly normal part of how the human body works. It's just that if it happens too fast or too much all at one time, it can be very uncomfortable for people with IBS, because people with IBS tend to be more sensitive to all the sensations that arise from the gut. So you and the next person could eat a bowl of chili, and one person might experience a little excess gas from that fermentation that goes on, but they might just pass it and that would be the end of it. And the person with IBS who eats the same exact thing, there could be the same amount of gas produced, but they become very symptomatic from the distension. In other words, the expansion or the being blown up a little bit like a balloon inside the intestines that happens after you eat those FODMAP rich ingredients in the chili. The other thing FODMAPs have in common is the ability to pull water into the gut. This doesn't affect everyone with IBS, but for people who have diarrhea predominant IBS, this can contribute to diarrhea.
And this is why, I've been at conferences where doctors ask us, "Oh, do you have a list that I could give my patients for low FODMAP? What are low FODMAPs?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, it's not just a list, but and we love our gastroenterologists and we love our doctors, and we're not slamming anyone. Like you said, they're so busy, but it's not just here, patient, Joan, try the low FODMAP diet. It's not that at all." And can you talk a little bit about why it's not just a list and you can just not eat these and eat those?
Right. One of the main issues with the list is it really ignores the fact that the elimination diet process has 3 steps. The list is all about the first step, which is a low FODMAP diet, but it forgets about the reintroduction and the modification or customization phases. The other thing that lists just can't really convey well is the fact that the same exact food can be high, medium, or low in FODMAPs depending on the serving size. Lists tend to be very black and white. This one's low FODMAP and this one's high FODMAP. But the reality is so much more nuanced. Broccoli, for example, is low FODMAP if you only eat 3/4 of a cup of it, which is a pretty decent amount. But if you eat a whole plateful, it's not low FODMAP anymore.
Oh, gee, I love broccoli. Maybe I was eating too much of it. But no, and that's a great point. It's the serving size.
It is. And, we've been encouraged for good reasons to eat more fruits and vegetables. And, honestly, it's not that unusual for people to eat a whole plate full of broccoli, especially if they're trying to eat healthier or lose weight.
Take us through the different phases, the elimination, reintroduction, customization phases, and give us some tips and tricks for, making sure that we're doing it right.
The first step, if you're going to embark on this whole process, is the low FODMAP phase. And that is a short learning diet phase. That short part is important to emphasize. Although there are good low FODMAP sources of every single nutrient, if you eat a wide variety of low FODMAP foods, it still should be short so that you can move on to the next steps. But anyway, the purpose of the low FODMAP phase is to find out whether it works to help you reduce symptoms and to start feeling better. And you might start feeling better right away. Usually I would say within a few days for diarrhea predominant IBS, and sometimes a few more days or even a week or two for patients who have IBS with constipation predominant symptoms. It does help people with all 3 of the subgroups of IBS, though. So that's the first phase. During the second phase, we actually learn what the patient's individual symptom triggers are. And we do that by keeping everything else low FODMAP, but we reintroduce one type of FODMAP at a time, typically. And, if your symptoms flare up, you have just traded a bout of symptoms for some important information about, a problem FODMAP for you. And you may find that some FODMAPs don't increase symptoms at all. That's awesome too. And then in the third phase, you customize your ongoing or final diet based on what you learned in the first 2 phases.
Well, thank you, Patsy, for breaking down the various phases for us. I know you've done such great work and people can find more in-depth information on your website. But for those of us who are listening to the podcast today, what are some successful low FODMAP strategies for phase 1? Like, what is a step 1?
Okay, so the first thing you want to do really is focus. Don't try to follow dietary advice from too many sources at once. If you're seeing other providers, for example, make sure that they're all on board with, really focusing on low FODMAP diet for the time being. As I mentioned earlier, keep it short. You want to really choose a sensible time to begin. It is going to take a little more time for shopping and a little more time for food prep while you're on this low FODMAP phase. So it's not a good time to start if you're under, extra time pressure with work or school. You want to try to keep the rest of your routine consistent. So it's not a good time to add supplements, for example, or take away supplements that you were taking before. Probably not a good time to start a new medication or stop a medication. Another hot tip, I think, is to make sure that you consume as wide a variety of low FODMAP foods as you can. Don't go beyond the requirements of the diet in any way unless you have to for medical reasons. For example, a low FODMAP diet is not dairy-free. That's a common misconception. It's really only the lactose in the dairy products that we need to limit. So, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Also, a low FODMAP diet does not have to be gluten-free. So, while it is true that the gluten grains are coincidentally lower in FODMAPs, you don't have to go gluten-free everything for a low FODMAP diet.
Now, some people have celiac disease and IBS, correct? So they would have to obviously avoid gluten.
Yes, that would be an example of a medical reason why you would have to do something beyond the low FODMAP diet. People with a lot of other nutrition concerns need to be extra sure to make an effort to work with a dietitian so that they don't over-restrict their diets here. Another thing to remember is that high FODMAP foods are not bad foods. There's no need to purge your kitchen of high FODMAP foods. You might be needing to eat them again in a few weeks during the reintroduction phase, in fact. So try to keep your thinking kind of flexible around high FODMAP foods and don't start to villainize them. They're not bad. And then my last suggestion is that, you just relax as you do this and enjoy some new foods, some new recipes, some new cooking techniques. Let's remember that this whole project is not ruined if you make a mistake or an exception once in a while. I tell my patients I really don't want them to go hungry. Sometimes you're in situations where you just have to do the best you can, and that's okay.
We keep hearing over and over again the importance of working with a dietitian. And can you explain why, again, because I want to drive this home, but also what if we don't have access to a dietitian? What is the next best thing that you recommend for patients?
Well, okay. The most important reasons for working with a dietitian include, getting a good nutrition assessment to make sure that this diet approach can help you. Also, a strategy and a plan make it so much more worth your time. It's really hard to do that with just a handout from, the internet or your doctor. And then the third reason would be if you have any other nutrition-related conditions that you need to kind of coordinate with this low FODMAP diet, it's invaluable to have a dietitian's assistance. But, it's not a reality for everyone to have that option. So I guess the second best choices would be some really great teaching tools that are prepared by dietitians. So, I think a book can go beyond what you can cover in a 1 or 2 or even 3-page handout with really getting into some discussion about how to make this thing work. The other essential tool, even working with a dietitian, is to have the Monash Low FODMAP Diet app. It's really the very best one available. It's produced by Monash University, which is the source of most of the laboratory data about the FODMAP content of foods. And it's just almost irreplaceable for patients that are trying to eliminate and then reintroduce FODMAPs.
The next phase is the reintroduction phase, and this can be an interesting phase, but it's a very important one. Can you give us some strategies for this phase?
Yes. So remember, during this phase, we are reintroducing FODMAPs one at a time, typically, and we are looking for symptoms so that we can decide which FODMAPs we need to continue to limit ongoing versus which ones we can start enjoying again. So one of the first tips is to make sure you're really clear on what symptoms you're monitoring and, what your baseline level of symptoms is. Remember, it's really normal to have some degree of gas and some variability in our stools. Thank goodness we are not like our pets eating kibble every single day of our lives and having the exact same identical looking poops uh, every single day either. So, because our diets vary from one day to the next, it's kind of normal to have some variation there. So, which symptoms are we monitoring and what is the baseline level? Sometimes people aren't sure they're ready to start the reintroduction process if things aren't perfect. And I can tell you that you're probably not going to get down to a level of 0 with your symptoms because IBS is multifactorial. FODMAPs and food in general, for that matter, are only part of the picture, right? And so you're going to be looking at the frequency and the intensity of symptoms, not just complete presence or absence of symptoms. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you bring up a good point. How long are the phases? Like, how long is the elimination phase?
Yeah. The elimination phase should be as short as possible. Is only long enough to make sure you know whether it works or not. And that's usually in my practice somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks.
Okay.
I try to have people move on by 6 weeks.
Okay. And then the reintroduction phase, how long is that?
That can take a while because you need to reintroduce one
at a time.
FODMAP at a time. One of the key concepts for the reintroduction process is isolating the variables. So what you want to do typically is reintroduce one FODMAP every week or so. Therefore, it can take at least 6 weeks because we have 6 big FODMAP categories, and sometimes we break it down even further than that.
And these are the foods or the FODMAPs that we've eliminated in the prior phase. When we're going to add them in one at a time and see how we go. Oh yeah, that's a long.
Yeah, it
does. But
does.
It's an important phase.
Yeah. And, so for example, I usually provide my patients with a plan that's week by week. And during the first week, they're going to reintroduce fructans. And so we decide, are they going to do it by reintroducing fructan containing food little by little over a few days, 3 or 4 days, and then take the rest of the week off and just go back to nothing but low FODMAP? Or sometimes I prefer to have people, reintroduce a larger quantity of fructans at the beginning of the week because you get a more obvious symptom response with that. Then you take the rest of the week off. The reason you have a little break after you do reintroduce the FODMAPs is that sometimes it takes a day or two for the symptoms to show themselves because you do have 30 or 40 feet of intestines, right?
Right.
So you want to wait and make sure you've observed for a long enough time period. But then the other thing is if you did have symptoms, you need to get over them before you start reintroducing the next FODMAP.
Now, talk about the importance of a food diary and symptom diary during this time, because I think this is really critical.
Yes, that is something that I ask of my patients because I might not see them until several weeks later. And as we know, it can be hard to remember how you really felt a month ago. So it's best if you keep notes on what happened when you reintroduced those fructans. Symptoms occurred, how bad were they? Maybe nothing happened. That would be awesome. And then you'll have something to discuss at your next visit with your dietitian or use on your own if you need to decide how to move forward at the end of this reintroduction process. Because you're probably not going to want to have fructans again while you're testing the other FODMAPs, while you're testing your tolerance to those other FODMAPs. So you'll need something to look back on.
Yeah. And how do we know what the order is?
It doesn't really matter what order you reintroduce things in. The one exception to that would be, if you suspect that it's going to take a really long time, and you're not going to be able to reintroduce all the FODMAPs right away. You might want to reintroduce the one that would make the biggest difference to you first. And that way, if you do have to take a break, you could be enjoying that FODMAP for a while. I know I just said that you shouldn't generally keep eating a FODMAP while you're testing other FODMAPs, but you can take breaks in this reintroduction process if you need to. So there could be reasons to do the most important ones to you first and leave the least for last.
Now for the customization phase, which I think is a cool phase. This is where we're going to take all of our data, right, from our food diary, from our learnings. We're going to make, going to look and see the connections. I love this stuff. So talk about the strategies for this phase, the customization phase.
Okay, so as we go along here, we have less and less, evidence-based strategies and more, like the art of dietetics. And so this customization stage is a little harder to address. But there are a few general rules that everybody can benefit from. The goal here is that you're going to be trying to eat the widest, most nutritious variety of foods that you can tolerate. So the name of the game here with FODMAPs is experimentation. It's pushing the limits. It's going like right up to the limit of what you can tolerate without overflowing from, an acceptable level of symptoms to a problem level of symptoms that's going to make you have to, stay home from work or miss activities, right? Therefore, we're going to try to be least restrictive. We're going to have you stop avoiding FODMAPs that were well tolerated during the reintroduction process.
So I can eat all the things that I thought were bothering me. That's great.
So,
that's awesome.
Maybe you'd been hearing that you should be on a dairy-free or low lactose diet if you have IBS for years. And when you do the lactose reintroduction, you are surprised to find out, oh my gosh, I'm not lactose intolerant at all.
So people, stop listening to social media. Stop. Listen to dietitian Patsy Catsos, what she's telling you here. You have the data if you follow this low FODMAP elimination and then reintroduction phase. And this is what the reality is, right, Patsy? Like, we are serious here.
You just proved it to yourself through the process of eliminating and then reintroducing lactose that you are not lactose intolerant. It doesn't even matter if you had a lactose malabsorption breath test that was positive. If nothing happens when you eat a sizable amount of lactose, you are not lactose intolerant. And after you've completed the reintroduction process, that means you don't have to worry about lactose anymore. End of sentence, period.
Oh, we love you, Patsy. This is great news for all those who thought we couldn't have that. I mean, this is great. I'm so glad we had you on today, because just for that one line is like gold. Thank you.
That was the money line, right?
But on a serious note, we do these conversations because there's so much noise on social media. Everybody's an expert, and it's really hard. There's a million products out there, and I'm so grateful for those money lines, because I hate seeing patients struggle and going down rabbit holes and trying every product that comes on their social feed and spending hundreds of dollars and still being miserable. So I digress, but now we're going to get back to the strategies for customization.
Okay. So we're basically, going to stop avoiding any FODMAPs that were well tolerated. For those that were poorly tolerated, we have to use some strategies to move on. Okay. First of all, we're going to make sure that we at least eat the low FODMAP serving sizes of foods that are sources of the problem FODMAPs. So for example, maybe you are symptomatic to large amounts of GOS, which is a fiber type FODMAP that's found in beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds. But those are pretty darn important foods. They have a lot of great nutrients in them. So it is definitely better for you to eat a small serving of beans, even if it's just a couple tablespoons, which would be a typical low FODMAP serving, 2 or 3 tablespoons of beans. It is better for you to eat a small serving than none at all.
That's a great point.
Those small amounts of FODMAPs are important prebiotics. They're food for the good bacteria in your gut. So don't avoid those small servings. Then, there are a few strategies that you can use to maybe push the limits on those serving sizes over time. Maybe you are somebody that can tolerate the moderate serving sizes of foods that contain your problem FODMAP. You probably learned something about that when you were doing the reintroduction process. So, even if you're starting with the green serving sizes of GOS-containing food, for example, I hope that you will continue to work your way up and see if you can tolerate those moderate serving sizes. And if so, consume them. Many people find that as long as they avoid the high FODMAP serving sizes for a food like that, they're going to keep their symptoms at a manageable level.
That's another money statement there. You're really doing great money statements here, Patsy. I'm so grateful, because that, I think we all can breathe this collective sigh of relief knowing that not everything is off limits. It's about the levels, and we need to learn those levels.
In fact, the vast majority of my patients find out that if they have just a little bit of onions and garlic, used to season food, as long as the whole entire recipe is not about onions and garlic, they actually do pretty well.
That's good.
So
that's
they,
good.
In their own kitchens, they might decide to leave the onion and garlic out if they're in a recipe, or cut way back on it. That's fine, but they don't have to, get rid of every speck of it in every food that ever crosses their lips. So they, that's great news.
Now, what about, we see products, and there's some great products that are generally low FODMAP. What is your opinion? We have Foddy Foods, for instance, and they have a whole line, very well respected, different sauces and things that are low FODMAP. How does a patient navigate that? Because not all FODMAPs are created equally. So how would you help your patients understand, should they be buying those low FODMAP foods on the grocery store shelves, or how does that work?
For those specialty grocery ingredients, there's a real place for them, especially for people that do find specific FODMAPs are problems for them ongoing. For 2 or 3 weeks, if you're handy in the kitchen, you may not need specialty products like that. If you're going to have to limit FODMAPs, or particular ones, especially over a longer period of time, you might get a lot of value out of using products of that kind. Or if you really don't have the cooking skills to modify your own recipes, you might enjoy those products.
Yeah, because there's some, and then this is another reason, I love the dietitians. I love you guys, because you add so much value to these dietary interventions that seem overwhelming to us as patients. And I know from listening to you and others speak over the last several years, there's so many nuances to this. There's maybe soaking the lentils, or canned lentils instead of the dry ones. I was like, really? Oh my God, I had to try that. Or making your own oils, like garlic oil, infused oil, so you're not getting the whole garlic clove, but you're getting that flavor. So I love those little tips and tricks that the dietitians have, like yourself. Can we find that on your website as well? If we're looking for those little nuances?
I have a blog, and if you go to my website, ibsfree.net, and look for the blog, you can read all kinds of articles about that kind of thing. There's a search function on the website in the upper right-hand corner.
Oh, great.
You could search, garlic infused oil and find my comments about it, or other ingredients that are of concern.
Now, you mentioned before we were reviewing what we were going to talk about, and you mentioned water solubility related solutions. What does that mean?
Right. So that would be, the soaking that you just referred to. So FODMAPs are water soluble, but they're not oil soluble. And we can use that in the kitchen and while grocery shopping to some effect. So any cooking method that involves soaking and draining, cooking and draining, will reduce the FODMAP content somewhat. It's hard to know exactly how much, but it's a helpful amount. Probably wouldn't be enough to render something low FODMAP, maybe not low FODMAP enough for the first phase of the diet. But during this customization phase, you can definitely use this idea to help in the kitchen. It probably means, for example, that, if you have trouble handling GOS, you're maybe never going to be a great candidate for a big bowl of lentil soup where you're actually consuming the cooking water. But you'd have a much better chance of tolerating a soup that, say, you put canned, drained beans in, another soup, a vegetable soup, say.
Yeah.
That might go pretty well for you, especially if your serving ended up only having, a quarter cup or half a cup of those beans in it. Because it's all about budgeting during customization. If the feature of the meal is going to be, you only have so much capacity to tolerate GOS, for example, you think to yourself, oh, what's going to be the feature of this meal? I really want those beans in that soup. I haven't had them for a long time. So, that's what you're going to have for your higher FODMAP thing. And knowing that you need room in your FODMAP bucket to handle the GOS in those beans, you can make decisions about the rest of the meal to maybe be on the lower FODMAP side on the vegetables you put in the soup or that you serve on the side to make sure all goes well for you.
Well, this is such helpful information, Patsy, and I'm so glad you mentioned some of the resources. Do you have any final thoughts? And we could talk about this all day, but we're going to do some more episodes. We have a whole series coming in the next couple months, over the next several weeks. So we're going to get into more details and maybe answer some questions that maybe pop up from our listeners.
If you're considering starting the low FODMAP diet, talk to your doctor about getting a referral to a dietitian. There are lots of resources available these days for finding someone in your local area. Also, telehealth is available, so a lot of us can work with patients who live in other states via telehealth. The low FODMAP diet is more than just a handout. It really helps to have a strategy and a plan. And I'll never forget that your long-range goal is to be able to eat the widest variety of foods that you can and enjoy them.
Yes. And just to touch on the resources, we have great access to registered dietitians on GI On Demand, Gastro Girl. The IFFGD has a directory, and the AGA as well, and GI On Demand through ACG. So there's lots of resources for patients, and these are registered dietitians with GI expertise, which is key because not everyone has the expertise working with patients with GI conditions. So that's really important. Well, Patsy, I'm so grateful to all of your great insights. We look forward to having you on another episode, advancing our understanding of this topic. Look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Gastro Girl podcast. For more information and resources, please visit gastrogirl.com. Do you have a question for Gastro Girl? Please email podcast@gastrogirl.com. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in the Gastro Girl podcast are not a substitute for medical advice from your healthcare professional. Please consult a licensed clinician in your state